So we'll talk through a very brief introduction to storytelling, and we're going to practice the couple of approaches that you can actually use in mentoring, and they're based on something called 6-part story method and moving from annals to simple stories. And I'll explain a little bit more about those as we go through. But what I wanted to say is that afterwards, after this seminar, when we've got the recordings and everything's made, we'll embed those links into a document, and we'll include a few papers or sources that you can, videos and things that you can access if you want to learn a little bit more about some of these techniques. So if we can go to the next slide then, please, Lawrence. And I guess a question that some of you might be thinking is, why on earth are we talking about stories? And I'm, as Lindsay said, I'm quite an experienced coach and mentor, and I like these methods because they fit with how we are as human beings. We like telling stories, and what we notice is that as we in our everyday lives, we have these sort of metaphors in our heads, and we create narratives that are based around them. So for example, if in the workplace I see myself as a cog in the wheel, that's quite a different thing from being, if I choose, I don't know, a gardening metaphor. And even if I'm working with a gardening metaphor, it's quite different whether I see myself as the kind of head gardener, or whether it's my own garden and I can plant the seeds where I feel they want to go, or I've got somebody telling me that I've got to plant onions here and they've got to be this many rows that far apart, and they've given me a big patch and a trowel to do it. So I think it's kind of what happens is that over time these kind of narratives start to shape how we tell our and make sense of our experience of work in the workplace. So as a mentor, when a mentee might come to me with an issue, or as a mentee trying to make sense of what's going on in my life, one of the things we can do is try and unpick and understand those stories, and then think about how we might tell them differently. So if we go to the next slide, Lawrence, these stories as well, they kind of, we have these narratives, and as I'm sure all of you will be only too familiar, we are living in very turbulent, uncertain times, and the more uncertainty and unpredictability there is in our lives around us, the more that being able to keep that narrative thread, understand what we're doing and why, becomes important. It gives us sort of a willing, makes it easier to take risks or to do something differently. It gives us a kind of connection between where we are, where we've been, where we're going. It helps us to build trust in relationships. And I think the role of mentoring in that is to kind of work together to try and find a path through all of that messiness that can help our mentees to achieve their potential. And perhaps we can change the narratives that we have if we start to understand them and where they're coming from, and that might allow us to kind of imagine or reimagine new possibilities. So Lawrence, if we can move to the next one. So one of the things about stories is no two stories are the same. They're all different. They mean different things in different contexts to different peoples. But there are lots of people who claim, and I'm kind of agreeing with them, that there are, in the stories that we tell, there are 4 main plot lines, and they can get mixed together and come up with combinations of 2 or even more of them. But by and large, most of our stories follow one of the, follow these plats. So we have kind of the comic, and that can be a black comic, or it can be, it can be a more uplifting thing. But we have there the protagonist, the main character, is often a deserving victim or a fool, and then we'll have somebody who's a bit of a trickster who tells a few jokes, and quite often those plots, particularly black comedy plots, tell us a little bit about um, something unfortunate that's happened, but quite often the person on the receiving end of it deserves kind of to have that pointed out to them. We have a tragic plot, and that's different from a comic in the sense, and this is why quite often comedy and tragedy go together and switch between them. But generally speaking, in a tragedy, the victim is doesn't deserve the outcome that they get, and there'll be some kind of villain, and there'll probably be somebody who helps. But so the tragedy, there's something traumatic about it, and it's kind of the misfortune that's befallen that person is, they don't deserve it. I'm going to go to the romantic next. We don't see many of these in organisations, it won't surprise you, but maybe more in the NHS than in others. But you have, in a romantic plot, you have a love object, and it doesn't have to be love in the sense of a kind of physical thing. It could be compassion. It could be, you have somebody who's giving that gift of love, and you might have somebody who has, well, you will have somebody who needs that love typically, and at the end of it, the kind of the care, the love triumphs. But the most common plot we find in organisations is the epic. And these are the stories that we like telling. They're the ones that go on. They're the stories that kind of we add to as we go through. I mean, I guess, you're probably sick of hearing it, but all of the stuff that's come out of COVID and how it's still carrying on, that's kind of so. And the thing about epics is we tend to make the protagonist into a hero, and in current times, heroes tend to be, they were much more complex during the sort of Greek and Roman times, when a lot of these plots first started to emerge. They were often a bit more flawed, whereas in these days we tend to kind of, put people on a pedestal and then perhaps enjoy it a little bit when they fall off. But so in an epic, there will be somebody who needs rescuing. The hero normally has a sidekick or an assistant, and there's normally a villain. So these don't necessarily have to be people. This is the other thing. So like, you can have an organization as a villain, or you can have um, a government or a country, or but the plot is, we can kind of see who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And at the end, unless it turns into an epic tragedy, we have some kind of success and a noble victory. So those are kind of, and you can probably already imagine that the language that attaches to those plot lines is quite different. So if we can spot in our relationships how people are positioning themselves in those kind of plots, then we can start to unpick a little bit and understand a bit more about the story and the meaning behind the story. And if we go to the next slide, Lawrence, why this is important is because it helps us to think about how we make sense of things. So people like David Bogie describes three ways in which we make sense in the storying space. So there's the backward looking, how did we get here? There's the prospective, where might we go in the future, and what might happen, how could what might my interventions for my actions, kind of how might they change that future. And then the bit that we often forget is that in the moment sense making, that what are we doing in the here and now. So that's understanding about what am I bringing, what's the baggage and the skills that I'm bringing in and that other people are bringing in. And that sort of sense making in action is really important. And what we're going to try and do in a couple of um, the two approaches to working with story that we're going to use today is look at what happens if I change the plot line. Yeah, so if I'm faced with a problem and I see myself as the kind of the victim in that problem, how can I switch to another a plot line that might help me to see some new possibilities? So if we go to the next slide then, Lawrence, why that's important is, it helps us to reflect, it helps us to reimagine and to reframe. So to kind of what happens if I look at this from a different perspective, or have I got something from a different context that I can bring into that? So this is, as mentors, when you're questioning, this kind of what you're trying to do is to bring in some of these different perspectives, these different contexts, that allow people to reframe for themselves, to step outside of their traditional narrative and see what other different outcomes might be possible. And then hopefully the response is thinking about how, okay, so what can I influence? I can't control everything. As I said, in these very unpredictable times, we can't control, but how do we respond to influence? And maybe thinking a little bit more about, when we're reimagining and we're reframing, we're focusing on the interventions, the actions that we take, and how they can be a high quality, even though they might not get the response that we expected. But if we're focusing on making the best that we can of the resources that we've got available, and we're acting as best as we can within that context, then we can get a confidence from doing that and recognize that we're not in control, that there are that we can influence, but we're changing that. So it's kind of then allowing us to think about those relational qualities that we bring to our work. I hope that's making kind of sense. So if we go to the next slide, Lawrence, has anyone got any questions on anything we've said so far? And if not, we're going to go into the next, the first activity. And how I'm trying to see, Alice, how many people have we got now? So we might want to think about how many people we put in a room. So this approach is called the 6 parts story method, and it's used quite a lot in therapy as well, but we use it a lot in coaching and mentoring, and it's a way of kind of people maybe coming out of, reimagining themselves as a character in the story, rather than um, getting caught up and entangled. So it's perhaps allowing you to step back a little bit and to create a little bit of distance between you and the issue, or the challenge that people are facing. And I found it works particularly well when I'm working with somebody who's facing the kind of more epic or tragic plot lines, because what you're doing is, by introducing these other forces and making them think about them, you're helping to kind of retell the story in a different way, and that imagines a new ending. So in this, you have a main character, who's, if you like, the story might be the storyteller, but they might be telling the story as though that's somebody else. They've got a task or a problem that they're facing and that they want to work with. And then the third bit is they have a helpful force. And these are in the stories that we tell in our organizations. I'm not sure quite why, but we often ignore the helpful forces. We spend much more time thinking about all the stuff that gets in the way, all the obstacles and the things that are hindering us, rather than what might be there that could help. So just on its own, making sure that you pay some attention and bring that helpful force into the story can often be powerful on its own. But equally, we don't want to ignore the fact that there are hindering forces, so we need to recognise and work with those as well. And then the action of the story, this is the kind of, what's actually happening. And the final bit is an ending. And an ending doesn't have to be final. In fact, it usually isn't. An ending typically leaves open some new possibilities for what might come next. So that's, I think, the first activity that we're going to practice. And Alice, how many people have, I'm just trying to have a look. We've got 14 participants, we've got 10, is that right?
Yeah, so I've got 1 room of 4 and 2 rooms of 3.
Brilliant.
Okay, Carol, can I interrupt? Do you want to just see if there, I mean, I just wonder whether, obviously there's a lot of information that we've shared for people to take on board, and obviously you're going to ask them to be creative. Have you got a small story that you could just illustrate so that people might get an idea?
Yeah, and actually, sorry, Lawrence, I should have said go on to the next slide as well. I've just realised I haven't still got this one up. Yeah. So, okay, a simple story might be that I see myself faced with having to go to to my line manager and say, actually, do you know what? I've been asked to do this by somebody else, and I am really, really struggling because haven't got enough hours in the day to do everything that you've asked me to do, and and that my other person has asked me to do, and I really don't know how to do. I don't know how to prioritize. So my helping force could be, and my line manager says to me, well, my stuff's more important than theirs. And they're both telling me exactly the same story. And I'm sitting at home thinking, oh, I don't know. I don't want to go into work today. I don't know what to do. I feel overwhelmed. And so my hindering force is I've got these two people who are both placing huge demands on me, and they don't talk to each other. They don't like each other. And I've got kind of stuck in the middle. And I'm going to I feel like I'm going to have to let one of them down. So my helping force might be my mentor. It might be it could be that I'm thinking I've got a really good friend who could perhaps, help me out in the short term. I could perhaps think about, what's delegating. I could involve a third person who's on the same level as my two managers and say, look, I can't do both of these. What do you think? It could be that I've got other things in my diary that are not particularly important that I can let go of, but I just need somebody to talk through and help me to see what those things are. So the action of the story might be, I've had these two very difficult conversations. They've even ended up emailing each other, and I just kind of feel stuck in the middle. I spot a good friend. We go and have a coffee together. She kind of helps me think through what might I let go of, and then just coincidentally, a line manager from a manager from a different department who I've got on really well with, and I've done a project with comes past, and we invite her to join us in this conversation. And between us, we managed to kind of realize, she said, oh, it's okay, I'll go and talk to Bev and just let her know, because I can see that this one fits much more importantly with the organisation's priorities. Yeah, so it's kind of like it's the helpful forces are coming out. So in the end, what happens after, I have a clearer idea about what I should prioritise, and I haven't had, I feel more confident to go back to Bev and say, I'm really sorry, I can't, I will do this, but it's going to have to wait until next month, because this is, I've worked through it and this is my priority. And actually, Bev, if, it could be that if you really need it that urgently, you ask Lindsay, because I happen to know she's got a bit of space at the moment, and she'd be really good. It'd be a good development opportunity for her, and she could at least get the ball rolling. Do you see what I mean? So it's kind of like I've got out of my dilemma. That's probably not a great story, but at least it gives you an idea. And maybe it links to what we want you to do in the breakout rooms, which is to think about. You can choose if one of you's got something that's actually happened and you'd want to work through, that's fine. As I said, we won't be recording what's happening in the room, but if you haven't got that, then the starting question is, last week in my clinical academic role, I faced, and you're working on it as a group. As I say, if one of you wants to bring something, that's fine, but if not, I'm sure you can imagine a situation.
Thank you, Carol. So what we're going to do is we are going to go into groups shortly. So as you know, you're going to be in a group of 3 or 4. I realise that people probably don't know one another. So can I just suggest that at the beginning of your group, you just take like less than a minute for each of you just to introduce who you are and what you're doing, so that as you begin to work together, you understand a little bit about the other people that are in the room with you. But if you can keep that fairly short, because we've allocated about 20 minutes for this activity, and we'd like you to come up with one story. It doesn't matter whether it's fictional or real, because then what we'd like you to do when you come back, we will bring you back into the main room at about 10 to 11 or just after. And at that point, we're just going to ask for one person from each group to sort of basically tell the story, because we're going to look for some common themes that are coming out as that story is told. So on that note, are there any other questions before we send you into the rooms?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you mean one story per group? So it's not one story each?
Yes, one story per group, that's all.
Okay.
That's all you have time for. Just one per story per group. So by being in groups, it'll be a little easier to come up with it more quickly. Okay, one story per group. Thank you, Mary. Okay, in that case, Alice is going to send you into rooms. Is that okay, Alice?
Yep, I'm sending you in now. It'll take about 10 seconds, so don't worry if you're waiting a little bit.
So that was really interesting, the last one, and interesting about the plots and the, you know, I did notice one of you mentioned specifically epics, but there were, as I thought there might be, there were more of those epic plot lines. So now if Lawrence is going to hopefully share some slides with us again, and we're going to kind of move straight on to the next activity, so that yeah, we felt it was important that you had a chance to practice a couple of things. And this is looking at moving from kind of annals, just like a listing, a keeping of just the basic facts, if you like, as they're seen, to creating a simple storyline. And one of the reasons for doing this is it's kind of a bit, I think it was one of the groups mentioned that, you know, like if you were going back in time, I think it was at group 3, that you'd actually kind of set the expectations, or that your character Andy would set the expectations from the outset. And I think that's really an interesting thought. And one of the things that this method is really helpful for is unpicking a story that's already, or a narrative that's already formed in somebody's mind, to try and kind of understand how things might be shifted. So it's more about telling a new story, or restoring. So the first two, it's a 3-step process, and the first 2 are based on kind of linear ideas of time, that are called chronology, which comes from I think the word comes from a Greek god, who was the person who kind of kept things, you know, going on track. And the third is a more linear, as a non-linear approach, so which is not often referred to as kairotic time. And the idea behind this is, rather than having time as something that is, you know, one thing happens and then that cause and effect kind of idea, I did this, therefore that, and so on. This is actually suggesting that time is punctuated, is kind of like, you know, things happen in our stories linked to events, not by specific units of time. And quite often something, when we tell our stories, we don't necessarily tell them in the features of them in the order that they happened. They might be and that they're not, you know, something comes in from the side that we weren't thinking about, and then something else kind of that felt important at the time gets dropped out of the story. So because in, you know, it's not seen, when we do that retrospective sense making, it doesn't feel important anymore. And one of the challenges, I think, with these very kind of unpredictable times that many of us are living in our organizational worlds, is that we can't really understand what's happening, except, you know, in a lot, and until we can only really see what the cause of something was when we look back on it, by which time it's too late to have reacted in it to that way. So we have to start thinking instead in these less kind of linear ways, and connecting things differently. So that's the idea behind it. I'll talk quickly through what we're going to do, and we've got so you don't have to remember everything and write it down. We've got we've put the main things that you have to do into a Word document, and Alice will pop them into the breakout rooms when you go into those. So the first step is what I say is creating these annals, and here we don't have a narrative. It's more of a list of events in chronological order on a timeline. I've got slides that I'll go on to next that kind of explain each stage in a little bit more detail. Then we're going to create a chronology, which is like a more of a narrative account, but it still hasn't got a story in it, and it's still following the timeline. And then finally, creating this simple story that involves bringing in the plot line to the narrative. So Lawrence, if we go to the next slide. So the annals, as I said, I think we've set up a Jamboard, and the link to that is in the Word document, as well as because obviously you can't pick it up from here. So you'll have that in your breakout groups. And I'm going to suggest that you use the yellow stickies. You can choose a different color if you like, but it's just use different colors for steps 1 and 2. And just randomly, all of you, place them on the timeline. I'm not suggesting you put dates on the timeline, by the way, but you're putting them in chronological order. So if somebody's put something in one place and yours comes after it, then you put it after it, and the other way around. And it's really in here, we're just looking for the, I say facts appropriately, but if you imagine that you were cooking a new recipe for the first time and you've got a shopping list, you don't want any more sort of description than that. So, you know, do you need 300, 3 onions and 2 carrots or whatever? But so at that is at that sort of level. Because there's several of you doing this, it doesn't matter if you come up with the same things, and just you're looking to see where there's clusters of activities and where there might be any kind of blank spaces. So that's the first step. The second step, Lawrence, if we can go to the next slide, is creating this chronology. And here, this is still following the timeline, but have a look at what are some of those things on the list, and maybe writing 1 or 2 sentences on a different color post-it, green stickies for example. That's just a bit of a narrative account. So you're creating a narrative account, so they're around the events that you want to expand on when you're thinking back of it. Like, is it really important what whether your onions are white, brown or spring, for example, or do you really need shallots? So it's at that kind of level. It's not masses, it's just explaining a little bit. And again, those go in chronological order on the Jamboard. And here, what you're looking for is any differences in the accounts of the same event. There might be things that are common to everyone. And then the final stage, so we've started to get a bit of a narrative in there now, but we still haven't got a story. And we get to the story by adding a plot line to the narrative. So again, perhaps just spend a minute or two looking at what's on the timeline, what's resonating with you as a group. Share your ideas, and then just as a small group, write a simple story. So this is, you're adding a plot line that connects the events that resonated with the group. And as I said earlier when I was introducing it, the main purpose, what you're trying to do here, is you're trying to unravel a sort of a complex situation by unpicking it, and then when you rearrange it, you can put it back together in a different way that allows you to restory or change the ending.